of National Review Institute and for joining us for this second installment of our spring book club on the works of George Orwell, which are seeing a resurgence in popularity and relevance today. NRI began this book club last April as a way to keep people connected during quarantine, and we have learned that it has continuing value for engaging our community of supporters. So as we resume normal life, we are committed to maintaining this book club as a source of intellectual stimulation and a way of connecting with each other. Uh, while too many conservatives feel increasingly isolated, these book clubs, the movie club, and other events that NRI does create a sense of community, or a safe space, if you will, for a spirited discussion on some of our most cherished cultural works. My name is Stephanie Cates. I'm based in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I'm happy to be moderating this book club, taking the baton from my former colleague, Francisco Gonzalez, who left us at the end of February for a new adventure teaching entrepreneurship and innovation at a free market university in Guatemala that was actually profiled 5 years ago in NR by our discussion leader today, Jay Nordlinger. So just a brief introduction. Jay is a senior editor of National Review, and he is our book fellow at National Review Institute. He writes about a variety of subjects, including politics, foreign affairs, and the arts. Jay is also the music critic for the New Criterion. So before we launch back in, a few housekeeping notes. We recommend you change your Zoom setup to speaker view to give whomever is speaking your full attention. If you'd like to participate by asking or responding to a question, please use the raise hand function to signal that you'd like to speak. You'll notice that you're automatically all on mute, so please unmute yourself if you're called on and remute yourself once you're finished speaking. So for our second installment of the Orwell Book Club, we turn to Animal Farm, an allegory with the oft-quoted line, "All animals are equal, but some are more equal than others." Here to lead us, Jay Nordlinger. Jay?
Well, Stephanie, thank you for that beautiful setup. And thanks to Miranda. And thanks to all of you who have joined. I thought I'd yak for a few minutes here at the beginning, as I was asked to do, to kind of get us rolling. And then we'll have a discussion, a group discussion, not group think, heaven forfend, but a group discussion. And if you're having trouble hearing me or I say something that's not clear, just give me a sign, vulgar or not. I can see all of you on my screen. I was flipping around a bit, reading about Orwell in recent days. And some people call these books prophetic. Animal Farm in 1984. I would just like to say that I would not term them prophetic. Orwell was writing about things that had already happened. He wasn't prophesying. Maybe he was saying, be careful, it doesn't happen in your society. But he was writing about things that were firmly established, that had already occurred. And he wrote these two novels. This wonderful journalist, this wonderful essayist. Why was he writing novels? Animal Farm in 1984 in that order. We read them out of order chronologically, but I think it was a good order anyway. Orwell spoke about this. He didn't necessarily say the following, but it is true that his work of journalism, Homage to Catalonia, didn't sell terribly well. And also he noticed the great success of Arthur Koestler's novel, Darkness at Noon, which was a fictionalization of something all too real, namely the Moscow show trials, right? But these two novels, Animal Farm in 1984, were a great outlet for Orwell because, as he said, he was able to combine his journalistic and artistic talents and urges. And so we have these two masterpieces from a journalist with a great deal of fictional talent, literary talent. And I'd like to quote a statement, and don't be shocked. I know you won't, because Orwell was a socialist, as some of the greatest anti-communists have been. I think of America's own Sidney Hook. I think of our labor leaders, George Meany, Lane Kirkland, people like that. But anyway, Orwell says, for the past 10 years, I've been convinced that the destruction of the Soviet myth was essential if we wanted a revival of the socialist movement. On my return from Spain, in other words, from the Spanish Civil War, I thought of exposing the Soviet myth in a story that could be easily understood by almost anyone and which could be easily translated into other languages. And boy, was he right. Now, a great many publishers didn't want to publish this story by the great George Orwell. They thought it was the wrong time. He wrote it during the war, as I mentioned in my notes that were circulated. And right after the war, in the summer of 1945, relations between the democratic West and the Soviet Union were very, very warm because of the Soviet Union's role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. And they thought, well, now is really not a great time for a novel attacking the Soviet Union. But of course, it was published. And when the Cold War began, a couple of years later, or a few years later, it began in earnest. Then Animal Farm really took off. And in fact, our CIA undertook efforts to infiltrate the book into the Soviet bloc. Now, the characters in the book, as you know, are specific people, but they're also types. They're also types of people. So a reader doesn't have to worry too much about the specificity. You know that Napoleon is Stalin and that Snowflake is Trotsky. Mr. Jones is obviously the Tsar. Old Major is Marx, with some Lenin thrown in, founding fathers. Squealer is basically any Stalin lieutenant, perhaps Molotov. You could pick another one. Boxer is the faithful, unquestioning Soviet worker. Moses the Raven, I'm sorry to tell you, is religion, and in particular the Russian Orthodox Church, which collaborated so closely with the Soviet government. You notice that in Animal Farm, as in his other novel, his later novel, 1984, Orwell lays great stress on the manipulability of language. He always thought that unclear, obfuscatory, muddy, dishonest language was an enemy of freedom, as it is. And you notice that he satirizes in Animal Farm changes in the party line, just as he goes on to do in 1984. And I thought I'd tell you a story that Bill Buckley liked about changes in the party line. This doesn't come from the communist world. It comes from Kansas City in the machine days of Tom Pendergast, the boss of Kansas City, Missouri. And there was a legislator on the floor arguing for a bill, why you've got to have this particular bill, and if we don't have it, we're going to perish, and all this stuff. And he gave a really ardent, passionate, eloquent speech in favor of the bill. And then when he's in mid-oratory, mid-breath, someone scurries up and slips him a note which says, the boss has changed his mind. And so the orator really thinks on his feet and says, all those things I've just said, that's what the opposition argues. Let me tell you what we say. And then he argued the exact opposite point of view. And Bill told the story a lot better than I did, but I thought you might enjoy it. I said in our previous session that I had interviewed a young woman who had escaped from North Korea. And when she was in South Korea, she read for the first time Animal Farm. And the way she put it to me, she thought it was all about North Korean society. And the way she put it to me, Animal Farm healed her of brainwashing. She said it cured me of the brainwashing I had. And I wrote about this. And I received a note from a reader, which I later published, and I have it here, and I'd like to read it to you. Dear Mr. Nordlinger, I used to teach Animal Farm in a freshman composition class. One of my students was a young woman from China who had lived through the Cultural Revolution. She came up to me after class one night and said, Napoleon is Chairman Mao. I still get chills when I think of this. And a few years ago, I wrote about a young man, a democracy activist in Cuba. And I'd like to read you the beginning of my piece about him. Article 39 of the Cuban Constitution states that the artistic creativity is free as long as its content is not contrary to the revolution. Danilo Maldonado Machado, AKA El Sexto, does not obey. He's a Cuban street artist and human rights activist. He has been in and out of prison many times. In 2014, he took 2 pigs and painted names on them, Fidel and Raul. He was referring to his country's brother dictators, of course, and he had been inspired by Animal Farm, Orwell's novella of 1945. Obviously, this act earned him a prison sentence. And I'd like to read a little later in that piece. In December 2014, President Obama announced his opening to Cuba. If international media were going to be paying more attention to Cuba, Maldonado thought it was a good time for an imaginative, daring performance. His inspiration was Animal Farm, which depicts a place where all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Ever since it was written, people trapped in totalitarian societies have been amazed by Animal Farm, by its accuracy above all. So, in Cuba, Maldonado took his 2 pigs, females as it happened, and gave them those famous names, Fidel and Raul. His plan was to take them to Central Park in Havana and put on a show, Rebelión en la Granja, i.e. Rebellion on the Farm, which is how Orwell's novella is known in Spanish. Maldonado knew he would be arrested and imprisoned. His aim was to show the world that freedom of expression in Cuba was denied. He never made it to the park. They arrested him on the way. Maldonado was charged with disorderly conduct, but he was never given a trial. He was sentenced to 3 years. As his supporters put it, 3 years for 2 pigs. The prison was Valle Grande, where he was confined with common criminals, as dissidents are in Cuba. Amnesty International declared Maldonado a prisoner of conscience. I just want to say, before concluding my remarks, that one of the reasons publishers balked at Animal Farm is that Orwell had chosen pigs as the rulers. And this was thought especially insulting. I don't know why pigs are more insulting than other animals, but that's just a tidbit. So let's hear from everybody. And you don't have to address me. You can address one another and just have a free-flowing conversation. I will stand by, but otherwise, forget me and just make your points and have your discussion. And thank you so much.
Okay, anyone ready to?
And if you're too shy, I'll call on you, which is really embarrassing and bold.
Well, I'll say something.
Great, John. Thank you.
And Jay, you've already alluded to this, but it seems to me that one of the most powerful themes in the novella, or maybe the most powerful theme, is the critical role played by information. Repeatedly throughout the novella, Orwell talks about how the commandments are changed. Memory is weak. The animals, few of them can read. Only the pigs can read, as I can recall. And some can read maybe just they know a few letters, but that's it. And without this information, they're also very easily manipulated, as they are. And in some instances, as in the case of Snowflake, and his role in the Battle of the Cowpen I think it was a cowshed, I think it was the first battle. He was a hero. And then later on, it turns out, no, he wasn't. He was the instigator of the whole thing. This is just an illustrative example, but all the animals just flipped, not having a clear memory themselves or any written record that they could recur to. And it just seemed to me this theme plays out continuously throughout the whole story, and to very powerful effect.
Yes, I think probably Orwell as a journalist was especially aware of this, the importance of information. I just did a podcast with Perry Link, the great China scholar who's been banned from China, who has been a great friend to dissidents over the years. In fact, he helped save the life of the great astrophysicist Fang Lizhe during Tiananmen days. But he was quoting Fang Lizhe, who said, it was either him or Liu Xiaobo, the late Nobel Peace Laureate. He talked about, and Perry gave me the Chinese phrase for this, the ignorancization of the populace. That these guys maintain control by keeping the population both ignorant and afraid. Both of these two things are very important, because when the citizenry generally loses its ignorance and fear, watch out dictatorship. So yes, this control of information is so important. And you remember the Soviet history of airbrushing people out of photos when the people fell from favor. And I think I related in our last session, the old Soviet joke was predict the future. You can't even predict the past.
Yeah.
Because Soviet authorities were changing the past so often.
Yeah.
It was curious. The ending, I thought, was really good, where you couldn't tell the pigs from the humans. The farm was changed to its old name, but mostly the dogs. And I think there's a point there, and unstated, of Machiavelli, that you either rule through love or fear. And so the dogs were there to provide the fear. But the most interesting thing,
that's the NKVD, isn't it? Those dogs.
the old NKVD, yes, long and ill-remembered. But they all, the ending where they all changed sides, and it was Napoleon that corrected the human, and it was now going to be Manor Farm. And all the humans liked it, by the way, which probably says something about what Orwell perceived in the West. Presumably the humans represented the West. I don't know.
But one of Orwell's one of the great propaganda points of people like Orwell, and I'm using propaganda now in a neutral sense, not in a negative sense, was, we may not like this point, but one of their great propaganda points was the new regime, the communist regime, is no better than the old regime of the czars. Now, for our money, we'll take the czars over the Bolsheviks. But in Orwell's sort of left circles, this was a very powerful point, that the new regime was as oppressive as the old regime. I think we all perceive that the new regime was greatly more oppressive than the old regime. And that was true, of course, certainly in the early years of the French Revolution, bad as the Ancien regime had been. So this is the ending. This is what, isn't it? This is the ending. Who can tell the difference now? John, I think you were following up on a point that you had made before, were you?
I'd start to say also, I mean, an instance in U.S. history that is somewhat similar is slaveholders, of course, prohibited their slaves from learning to read. Also, I mean, they wanted to keep them ignorant.
Well, what a good point. What a good point. And
well, I say that because I just saw a reference to Frederick Douglass very recently, and how he was taught to read, by the mistress of his slave in Baltimore. And when he was really quite young, he was very eager to learn to read. And that really opened up his eyes a very great deal. And so that's what brought that to mind.
Literacy is a weapon. And I remember Donald Kagan telling me, the great classicist, education is self-defense, he said. And a typically aphoristic way that he put it, in education is self-defense.
That's
And
great.
I talked to a dissident once. I think he was a Cuban, speaking of Cuba, and he was able to be visited by a foreign reporter. And this doesn't quite have to do with literacy, because the dissident was literate. And before the reporter left, he said to the dissident, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And the dissident said, "Leave me your pencil. Could I have that pencil?" I mean, to us, it just seems such a humble object. I don't even have pencils or pens anymore. I just use my thumbs on my phone.
Mm-hmm.
Boy, he eyed that pencil and he thought, God, what a prize that thing is.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, let's see. Sam Lissman, you're up next.
Sure. Hey, Jay. The first thing I wanted to do was comment on John's point about slave societies, particularly the propaganda that was put out in Animal Farm about how they were, there was all sorts of sexual impropriety and there was cannibalism going on. And whenever people talked about plantations being run by the slaves, or the slaves being freed and allowed to have their own place, those were the rumors that were started, was that it was degenerating in that way. And it really struck me that Orwell was able to make this apply to more than just the Soviet Union. But the other thing I wanted to mention, I think it was John, but it might have been Shelley, who mentioned the dogs, and how Napoleon had taken them from the beginning and had made them his personal attack dogs. And I don't remember the exact specifics, but I remember in Norman Podhoritz's Ex-Friends, it was either Mailer or Ginsburg is yelling at him that we'll get you through your children.
Ginsburg, yeah.
And how powerful and how effective it is to be in control of the education of the young, just like we saw in 1984. And some would say, just like we're seeing today, the indoctrination. And if everything you're taught leads you in one direction, that's the direction you're going to go. And you saw that completely with the dogs.
I'm often quoting Oscar Hammerstein II and his lyric from South Pacific, his song about racism, "You've got to be carefully taught." Yeah, you don't come out of the womb with those thoughts. You have to be taught them. Yeah, so true.
Great. Okay. Let's go to Roy Miller. Roy?
Yeah, Jay, when you mentioned the Soviets airbrushing people out of photos, I immediately thought of our tearing down Confederate monuments and, to a lesser extent, propagation of critical race theory. You see similarities?
No, but I do understand the point of view. I think monuments, I think, are separate in that some monuments are meant to teach and memorialize, and other monuments are meant to celebrate, honor, and praise, where we put men, or in some cases women, literally on a pedestal. So yeah, I'm not of the school that says that when you tear down monuments, you're eradicating history. It depends on what you're doing. For example, people have pointed out that there aren't monuments to Hitler, yet we managed to learn about the Third Reich and the World War II and the Holocaust. So, frankly, it all depends. I do appreciate memorials that teach And I wrote a long piece on this issue of Confederate memorials so that I would never have to talk about it or write about it again. One of the things I said was, to me, one of the most moving memorials in Arlington Cemetery is the Confederate memorial with the Daughter of the South facing south. It's very moving to commemorate those dead, the Confederate war dead. But when it comes to monuments, to take an easy one, Nathan Bedford Forrest, this is a big discussion. So I maybe that's saying saying enough for now. But I can just say in a nutshell, I'm not for whitewashing anything at all. But the monument issue is quite tricky. In that, another thing I've said is that after 1989 and again after 1991, monuments to Lenin and Stalin were taken down all over the Soviet bloc and the former Soviet Union. That was fine with me because the people there didn't think that those men ought to be on pedestals. But airbrushing, memory holding, to use a 1984 term, is a totally different thing. What do you think, Roy? You tell me now. I've talked enough.
No, I see your point on that. What about the growth of critical race theory? Any similarity there? I mean, it's such a phony concept.
Can I plead something to you? I'm really not clear on what it is, except I know it's bad. I know it's nonsense, and I know it's a tool of indoctrination. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I guess I am for realism in all educational matters, and also for pluralism. And I listen to these horror stories from campus and I think, my God, I wouldn't last a week. You know, there have been times when I've kind of thought of, not to get too personal, this is not why you signed up, but I thought of myself and maybe in a university setting and I don't know, teaching writing or something, but you know, the first day I'd use the wrong pronoun or something, I'd be cooked. I know I wouldn't last. I'm just so grateful to be where I am. And I hope we can have some sort of spring, some sort of liberalization at our universities, because it's pretty lousy, even in a free country. And I'll quote you a little quip by Abigail Thernstrom. The old line was that that universities were oases of free thought and, you know, a sea of oppression or something like that. And she said that too many campuses were oases of conformity in a sea of freedom.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you, Roy. Anyone?
Andrew Morgan, do I hear you speaking? Let me zip around here. Denise Feddersen, I see that you're remaining quiet. Do you mind telling this group whether you were familiar with Animal Farm before you came to the United States? You're gonna have to unmute yourself, Denny. There you go.
I don't think so, and I don't remember really. It's such a long time ago. I think I read it first in English.
Mm-hmm.
But I would expect that communists were not that keen on having their young population to read this. To me, it's as if a history is repeating itself. It's like a formula when you, it can happen in Russia, it can happen in any country in the world. And I see so many similarities between Russia or the Czech Republic, where I come from, or the United States here today, and it's terrifying.
Well, Denise, what do you think of Orwell's choice to write a little story or an allegory? Do you regard that as effective? I guess for some people it might be too, I don't know, too subtle, too allegorical. Or I guess anyone in a so-called fear society would certainly get it. But what do you think of the idea of, by the way, when I was thinking of allegories, the most famous one ever written is Job. And this still informs humanity, you know, centuries and centuries and centuries on. So Orwell went this route. And at least in 1984, you have people, right? I mean, it's still a novelization, but you have people. And this you have farm animals, which is, I think, both bizarre and inspired. What do you think?
I think it's pretty explicit, actually. I know that he's using animals, but I think it could be, it's adaptable to many different situations. And I think people understand it well. I don't think there's much hidden, but
Well,
I could be wrong.
don't forget, you know everything.
Well, no, it's I think just like what you mentioned about the person who came from North Korea, that she understood it immediately, and she saw a similar situation from where she's coming from. And as I said, I think it's almost universal. It's like a recipe. It could be replicated unless you learn from it. So maybe that was his message, is sort of a warning, not necessarily a recipe, but a warning: don't repeat this. It's so easy to fall into this.
Mm. Did anyone else have a view on this? It occurs to me that once someone thinks of something and the idea is a success, it seems kind of obvious. And you go, oh, yeah. But I think comedians talk like this. Can you imagine the pitch session? When the guy says, you know, I'm going to talk about what has happened in the Soviet Union, an authoritarian or totalitarian society. But by the way, I'm going to use farm animals. I mean, it's just kind of freaky, but what a stroke of inspiration, in my view.
I have a question that I'd like to pose back to Denisa, and then another question for the group. Denisa alluded to, I think if I understood her correctly, she was alluding to things that she sees today in the United States that remind her of, or that recall events in Animal Farm. And so I'm kind of curious about what she sees in present day United States in Animal Farm. So that's one question. But the second question is, I'm wondering where the Animal Farm equivalent, satirical equivalent is for the present day CCP. Because I'm not familiar with any satirical writings of the CCP's approach. So back to my first question really was to Denisa, what she sees in Animal Farm that also reflects what she sees in the United States today.
Well, I would start with the language, for example, how language changes and how rules change. So the words that everybody understood yesterday have a new meaning today. And it's as simple as, we're going to be opening up schools. And this is very current topic specifically in California, where we live now. And you hear, yes, we're going to open schools. And then you're thinking, okay, they're going to open schools, meaning from 8 until 2 every day, only to find out, no, it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 10 until 12. So again, the same words, but a different meaning. And it happens in the newspaper. It happens on the news. It's continual. So I would say the language, and then the rules that are different for different groups or different people. What I also saw is trying to divide all of the animals into different groups and then get them not to like each other. I think that's a technique or something that is, to me, it's obvious in our society today that we are not to like specific groups, or we are not to like each other. I remember the phrase, everybody is equal, and, and you see it, oh, animals are not to sleep in bed, and then you add with sheet. So again, the language where you have a rule that everybody understands, but then now the rule suddenly changes without your agreement or without you even knowing it. So I guess I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly, but that's how I saw it, how I understood it, and how it became sort of relevant to what I see today here.
Yeah, no, I understand. Okay, thank you.
Excuse me,
Um,
Stephanie, this is Norm Hapke. I don't know how to raise my hand, so I'm going to be impolite and butt
Hi,
in.
Norm. No, go ahead.
Hi,
Just barrel
Norm.
ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. Jump right in.
One of the things that's very interesting, I don't know a lot about Leo Strauss, but one of the things that he talked about intellectuals from Plato to Machiavelli, etc., was what he called esoteric writing. That is, in societies where intellectuals were powerless and the state was more than willing to camp on them when they said the wrong things, much of what they would do would be writing that ostensibly said one thing, but really was saying something else. One of the wonderful parts of our society is that George Orwell and many other people feel free enough to where they do not have to use esoteric writing in talking about subjects, because the governments upon which we depend are much less imperialistic authoritarian. However, the point that one of the gentlemen made before, what do they do in the CCP? My understanding of what they do is there's a very great science fiction writing. And in writing about science fiction, many of these people are able to, in China, are able to bring out some of the difficulties and problems that their society has, very much like the esoteric writing of Leo Strauss. Thank you.
yeah.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Norm
Yeah,
mentions.
Yeah, so I was actually asking a slightly different question, Norm. That is my impression that there are folks in China that are writing and communicating in that manner. What I was really wondering about is where is, who and where is the Orwell equivalent writing the satirical novels about the CCP, here in the United States for an American audience, right? Not people in China writing for a Chinese audience, because it seems to me that there's a deep need for an understanding of how the CCP's approach is similar to, but also different than that of the Soviet Union.
What I would say in that is that many people these days think that you cannot write about a society other than yourselves. In other words, there are people who get really trashed on by writing about a different race of their own. Now, it may be that Americans do not have the moral standing to write about what's happening in China, and we don't have enough knowledge of doing that. That may be a possible answer to your question.
Okay. Oh,
I was going to say, though, briefly, it's one thing to remember that in our society, the new norms of, I'll call the therapeutic society, are being enforced by not the government, but by corporations, and very much so. And it seems to me a real issue for conservatives and people who like the free market, people who like the Bill of Rights, et cetera, is what to do about corporations that infringe on it. Because I think that's the growing trend in the last few decades.
Well, I was trying to think of novels about communist China, and I couldn't think of novels, but rather lots of memoirs. The memoirs I've read about individual lives say so much about living in that society. And I want to mention one. I had the experience of reading a rare little book. I mean, by that, I mean, it hasn't been widely read and it's small. It's called Gang of One, Memoirs of a Red Guard. And the book is written by a fellow named Fan Shen, who at the time I think was teaching in Minnesota. And I wrote about this in National Review, and I had the strange feeling of believing that I was holding in my hands a little masterpiece, something that might be read hundreds of years from now, that describes how it was back then in communist China. And as far as I know, this book has not been widely circulated, but I believe it deserves to be a classic. Again, it's called Gang of One, Memoirs of a Red Guard by Fan, F-A-N, Shen, S-H-E-N. Also, Norm mentioned Leo Strauss. You may want to get a hold of his masterly Persecution in the Art of Writing. This is what Norm was referring to, Persecution in the Art of Writing. He talks about the tricks and techniques that writers have learned to get their points across. One classic thing is you start with something, you sandwich what you really want to say in the middle, and then you end with something else and try to make your real message as inconspicuous as possible. And I'll give you a couple of things that are related. David Price Jones once told me about his book on the Arab world called The Closed Circle. In some newspaper in the Arab world, might have been Egypt, might have been elsewhere, there was a great attack on David's book. And it says, this book is a work of Orientalism. This racist colonialist named Price Jones has written libelous things about us. For example, this, and there's a block quote of 200 words. And then the colonialist, racist, Orientalist goes on to say, another block quote of 250 words. Isn't this despicable? Isn't this defamatory? And a friend, I believe an Arab friend of David's, said, these are rave reviews. This is the way they're getting your book around. This is the way they're circulating your book by these quotations. You consider it a rave review, said David. This fellow said to David, and it happened more than once. Also, I want to tell you that I believe we're going to read Orwell's essay for next time on politics in the English language, but maybe Stephanie and Miranda will want to include another one. It's short, it's just an essay written in 2002. It's one I've come to cherish more and more in recent years. It is about the status of the intellectual and indeed other people in China, but it could be about many, many, many other situations as well, including in free societies. It's called The Anaconda in the Chandelier by Perry Link, the aforementioned Perry Link, the great China scholar. And it's about how the Chinese Communist Party keeps control with fear. And that is, you don't want to cross the line, but here's the thing. They don't draw the line for you. You have to guess where the line is. The rules aren't clear cut. So Perry likens it to an anaconda in the chandelier overhead, this great snake coiled in the chandelier overhead. You have no idea what will set it off. So you tiptoe around the house. You avoid loud noises. You self-censor. You self-monitor. So the police don't have to do it. This is such a brilliant thing. I commend it to one and all.
That's great. And who wrote that, Jay? That's not an Orwell piece.
That's Perry Link, The Anaconda in the Chandelier. And he says something funny at the beginning. I don't know Chinese, sadly, but apparently the word for cat is very, very close to the name Mao. It's just a matter of the inflection in Mandarin you use. So the old joke in former times was you had to be careful about discussing your cat with your wife or husband because the neighbor might think you're talking about the chairman. David Coleman, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, actually, I've worked in China for 5 years, pretty much, and one thing that's often done in the Chinese language is it's a tonal language. So Homonyms is a way of poking fun at the orthodoxy there. For example, a Cao Nima could be this to your mother, or it could be talking about a mud grass horse. So on the internet, they will talk about innocuous fables and put little stories, but they're really going to the censor, extending the middle finger.
Mhm.
Another thing they'll take the slogans of the society, like they were looking for seeking a harmonious society. And when people get canceled or cut off on Weibo, their internet chat, they will say, I've been harmonized.
Wow.
And if you want to see someone who's actually doing frontal assaults on the CCP, Ai Weiwei, who's the artist, architect, designer of the bird's nest in Beijing for the Olympics, he confronts them. And at one point they gave him 1 million renminbi fine. And 1 million people stepped forward and paid 1 renminbi to pay that fine. So that's a very powerful way of saying, I'll take your fine, and the society is saying, screw you.
What a show of support.
And last thing is, Chinese people, they'll tell me, you know, in America, you have freedom, but you must follow the rules. Here, we have no freedom, but we don't follow any rules. It's very chaotic on one level. The way I describe it is, if I ask anyone here, how many times have you driven on the wrong side of the road? Usually it's never or once. There, it was a daily occurrence in my life. Because if I can drive on the wrong side of the road, get ahead for a block, May 1st, they will do it. It's a different culture.
You know, you've reminded me of an elementary point, and I'd like the parents and the grandparents in the room, so to speak, to confirm this if they want. Little children love rules. It makes them feel safe to have rules. And when there aren't rules, when there's disorder, there's a sense of unsafety. There's a sense of fear. So onto the Chinese Communist Party is rather brilliant in declining to say what you can say and what you can't, how far you can go, because then you're ruled by the anaconda and the chandelier. You don't know, so you tiptoe around. And of course, the United States is not a fear society in most respects, but I had a dear colleague a long time ago who said he would put outrageous things in his drafts. And he'd say, sometimes you just need to brush up against the electric fence to be sure it's still turned on. Well, for him, all he got was edited. For someone else, you could wind up in a dungeon.
So,
Shelley, did I see you were going to say something? Shelley? I think I cut you off.
no, we were going to go to Norm Hapke. Norma,
Oh, okay.
another question or comment?
The point you made is very apropos, Jay. My wife is a psychotherapist, and when she was dealing with dysfunctional families, one of the things that she found was that children needed to be able to press up against something and have something pressed back at them. And that way they felt safe because they knew what their limits were. And when you don't do that for a child, what sets in is sort of an anomie, a rootlessness. They don't know how to deal with the world, and it scares them, but it also emboldens them. And so a lot of very children who are terribly unruly are in that situation. I can understand, however, the terror of the anaconda in the chandelier, because there aren't any things to push up, but up there somewhere is somebody, and you don't know what you're going to do wrong to set them off. And that's kind of scary.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jay, Yeah, I'm not sure that I asked one half of my question as clearly as I could have. When I think about George Orwell writing Animal Farm, at the end of the war, what he was doing is what he accomplished, among other things, is write something that was approachable, that conveyed a very clear message as to what the horrors were in the Soviet Union. So he wrote at a time that we weren't quite in the Cold War, but it was imminent. If we're not already in a Cold War with China, it's imminent. And so what I'm looking for is, what is the equivalent of today's Animal Farm educating that's approachable, that educates the American populace about the CCP and the horrors of the CCP.
Mhm.
So I understand that there are Chinese dissidents doing interesting things, but there are none that are known to the people in the United States. But there's no Orwell or Dostoevsky that can be read by people in the United States that's educating them about the horrors of the CCP, going into that effectively can help mobilize a country for our second Cold War.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm Googling here. What was the name of that book? There was a book published long ago that had a big impact on a lot of us by a Belgian journalist named Simon Leys, Leys, who has since died. And I think his book, it was Images Brisées in French. It might have been published under the title Wounded Images or something, but it had a great impact among intellectuals in the West. And also that I think of that great biography of Mao by the husband and wife team. I think she might be Jung Chao and he's John Halliday. And I remember a writer in Time magazine said that this book went off like an atomic bomb. But no, where novels are concerned, where fictional treatments are concerned, I can't think of any. But I can think of mounds and mounds of great journalism.
I was thinking, listening to all this, that historians in the Roman Empire talking about previous emperors resorted to the tactic of saying, "No, I wouldn't say this, but a lot of people had said this," and they would go on, and then he'd remind everybody, "Well, I wouldn't say this," to basically turn away the wrath of the emperor or the emperor's friends. So it's not quite a new tactic. I think it's more refined now, obviously, and it's not just in Latin, but yeah, I mean, there are ways to get around things, and Orwell's was one of them.
That's so true. And this isn't quite the same, Shelley, and maybe this is too light a remark for this discussion, but I'll tell you a joke that William Safire told, that his boss, President Nixon, was always saying, "Now, some people counsel that I take the easy route." And Sapphire said, maybe someday in a discussion, someone should actually say, "Mr. President, you should take the easy route." So he'd be honest in saying, "Some counsel I should take the easy route." It's funnier the way Sapphire put it. But, yeah.
Jay?
David Coleman, by the way, thank you for holding up that book. Yes, that was a blockbuster book, wasn't it?
That's David.
Life and Death in Shanghai, yeah.
Great.
And I've had an opportunity to speak to some people who went through the Cultural Revolution, both older and some people who went through as young people. And yeah, speaking to those people is very moving.
I wrote a long time ago about a lady, a lecturer in Chinese at the University of Chicago, who I think she teaches the Chinese language in order to earn her daily bread. But her real life work, her life mission, is to chronicle and memorialize the Cultural Revolution. And she said the things that most moved her when she was a girl is that she found a copy of the Diary of Anne Frank. And she started keeping a diary. She even addressed it Dear Kitty. And then she destroyed what she had written immediately, unlike Anne, because you could be killed for what you said in your diary. So she found the diary of Anne Frank, and she found one of Solzhenitsyn's novels, I think Cancer Ward. It might have been The First Circle, might have been the Gulag Archipelago. And she told me there were 6 copies in the whole of China of this book. And she found it someone in the English department, and she had learned to read English, of her university had it. And so with the inspiration of Anne Frank and Solzhenitsyn, she decided to dedicate her life to collecting testimony about the Cultural Revolution. And she has a website devoted to this. Her name is, I'm going to spell rather than pronounce, her name is Qing, and then Wang or Wong.
Ching Wang.
She is a fabulous woman.
I think we have a couple more raised hands, and we can hopefully put them in before the top of the hour. Let's go with Sam Lissman first, and then John Farabee.
So Jay, when our friends on the left read Animal Farm, when I read Animal Farm, it was so clearly and powerfully speaking to what it is they call for. When they read it, do they just not see it, or do they think that the way they'll do it, the pigs won't take over, that everybody will stay, all animals being equal, and it just won't happen this time, even though it seems to happen every time anyone tries to do this?
It'd be interesting to ask them. My guess is most people think of the bad guys as their opponents. That's my guess. Yeah. And to my mind, this is a parable about dictatorship in general, about, as Donald Rumsfeld used to put it, about people who want to tell you what to do when you get up in the morning, rather than you're deciding yourself what you're going to do when you get up in the morning. I love that little formulation he had. But clearly, Orwell is aiming what another great journalist, Jean-Francois Revel, called the totalitarian temptation. And that reminds me that the last article that Charles Krauthammer wrote was called The Authoritarian Temptation, which is a direct borrowing from Revel. It's published in the collection that Charles's son put together. John?
John.
Yes. Yeah, a question about Orwell himself at the end here, Jay. And given his beliefs about and what he's written about Russia and the Soviet Union, what is it that sustained his faith in socialism?
I think probably he was in favor of what we would call today a generous liberal welfare state, rather than rigid, regimented socialism. That is my guess. What some people call democratic socialism, which you might think of as McGovernism on steroids. Of course, if he had lived longer, who knows? I mean, I'm writing about this fellow now, Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong businessman who's just been sentenced to prison. And I remember being in Taipei and walking into the headquarters of his newspaper, the Apple Daily. And I'm in the lobby and I'm staring at a bust of Hayek, glasses and all. And there's an inscription and this then young man, somehow growing up in China, later going to Hong Kong, another part of China, somehow he'd found Hayek and Milton Friedman. Lives are weird. And so look what happened to James Burnham, for example, and half the other people who helped found National Review with Bill Buckley. All these former lefties, Max Eastman, Willy Schlamm, Frank Meyer, John Dos Passos, on and on. I wonder if Orwell had had more time, what his views would have been. Mm-hmm. And Stephanie, if you don't mind, I'd like my last comment to be this. Yes, a great journalist. Yes, a great mind. Yes, politically brave and so on. But, or and, George Orwell, what a beautiful writer. I mean, that's not nothing. What a beautiful writer. And you want great singers to sing songs you like, and you want great ball players to play on your team. And we're just so lucky that this gifted writer was on the anti-communist side. There are a lot on the other side, I hate to tell you. But just what a man. What a man. No wonder so many people I admire most in life admire him almost tops. One would be Robert Conquest, my late great friend. I said to him one day, by the way, when we were in elementary school or junior high, people say, "What are you?" They really meant, what is your ethnicity and what is your religion? The kids in my school would say, "What are you?" So I said to Bob Conquest, "What are you?" Meaning politically. He said, "I will accept that I'm someone once called me a Burkean conservative," Conquest said, "and I'll accept that I'm that. But really," he said, "Orwell spoke of the law and liberty lands, the lands with law and liberty." And Conquest said, "I'm a law and liberty man." And he got that straight from Orwell.
Mhm.
And that has never left me.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, we'll end it there. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Jay, for leading us in this discussion.
And Stephanie, what's next time? I know that you have it. What are our assignments?
We have the essay Politics and the English Language, written by Orwell. It is available online. You can look it up. I believe we had a link, and we will have a link in our follow-up emails for this. So,
And speaking of link, let's add Perry Link, maybe his Anaconda and the Chandelier. It's very short. It was published in the New York Review of Books. And I'll see if I can dig up a suitable excerpt of Persecution and the Art of Writing by Leo Strauss. David Coleman, are you holding up a book there, sir? What do you got? I can't see it. Can't quite see it.
Outside Tongue's Xiao Hongshu, Little Red Book.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And here's Persecution in the Art of Writing.
By the way, Perry Link was telling me in this podcast that Xi Jinping has put out his own little red book, his own thoughts.
Yeah, his
And
core of
Perry's judgment. Perry's a very mild, he's a great, brave, bold, I would say even heroic man. But when he speaks, it's usually in mild, measured terms. He said, mediocre at best.
wonderful. Well, so we'll add those to the reading assignments, and we'll see everyone next week.
Right. The big one will be the Orwell essay. So if you want to glance at the others, fine. But the concentration will surely be the Orwell essay.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
Thank you.
evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.